Imagine waking up tomorrow to a world frozen solid, fields locked in ice, soil turned to stone, roads buried under snow, no trucks arriving, no food coming in, no help on the way. For most people today, that would mean immediate hunger. But for cold climate farmers, this wasn't a catastrophe. It was simply another winter. They lived with short growing seasons, constant crop failures, and months of snow. And yet, they didn't starve. They learned which plants could survive when everything else failed. Crops that grew beneath the snow, roots that waited underground through months of ice, greens that returned on their own every spring without being replanted. Today, you're about to discover the 15 crops that allowed cold climate farmers to survive ice, famine, and collapse, and why these forgotten plants still matter in a world that may soon face those same conditions again. Cold climate farming has always been a battle against time. Short summers, sudden frosts, frozen soil, and long winters meant that failure was not an option. There were no second chances, no global supply chains, no emergency imports. Every planting decision had to be deliberate. Farmers needed crops that could endure cold, recover from damage, and remain edible long after harvest. Survival depended not on abundance, but on resilience, choosing plants that refused to die when winter arrived. We begin with rutabaga, a root crop built for frozen worlds. Hardier than turnips and slower to rot than potatoes, rutabaga thrived in northern soils where winters were long and unforgiving. Its thick skin protected it from frost, allowing roots to overwinter safely underground. In cold climate communities, rutabaga was survival food, dense, filling, and dependable. When harvests failed and grain ran low, families relied on rutabaga to carry them through the darkest months. What made rutabaga truly indispensable was how well it stored. Unlike delicate vegetables, it didn't need cellars, barrels, or constant attention. Packed in straw, sand, or simply left in the ground beneath snow, rutabaga remained edible for months. In regions where winter cut off all trade and travel, this mattered more than yield. A single harvest could quietly sustain families long after fresh food disappeared from the landscape. Rutabaga was never considered a luxury. It was honest food, associated with hardship, long winters, and survival. But that reputation was exactly why it endured. When bread ran out and grain stores thinned, rutabaga filled pots, stews, and bellies. It delivered calories, vitamins, and stability when nothing else could. In cold climates, crops weren't judged by taste or beauty. They were judged by whether they kept people alive. Field peas were one of the most important survival crops in cold climates because they solved a critical problem: protein. In regions where meat was scarce or seasonal, peas provided strength through plant-based nutrition. They thrived in short summers and cool temperatures, maturing quickly before early frosts arrived. Once harvested, peas dried naturally, transforming into a dense, lightweight food that could be stored for years without spoiling. Unlike fresh vegetables that demanded immediate use, dried field peas waited patiently. Stored in sacks, jars, or wooden bins, they required no special conditions. Snowstorms could block roads for months, but peas remained ready. Soaked and boiled, they became thick soups and stews that warmed bodies and stretched scarce supplies. In cold climate households, peas weren't emergency food. They were planned insurance against isolation and hunger. Field peas also protected communities from total crop failure. Even when grains rotted in wet summers or frost destroyed gardens, peas often survived. Their ability to enrich soil meant they strengthened future harvests as well. Cold climate farmers understood this balance instinctively. Peas fed people, supported other crops, and reduced risk across seasons. They weren't grown for profit or taste, but for stability in an unpredictable, frozen world. Broad beans were uniquely suited to cold climates because they tolerated frost better than almost any other legume. Farmers planted them early, sometimes while snow still lingered on the ground. Their strong seedlings pushed through cold soil, gaining a head start in regions with painfully short summers. This early resilience made broad beans a cornerstone of northern diets, delivering calories and protein when few other crops could even survive. Cold didn't weaken broad beans. It often helped them. Light frost reduced pests and slowed disease, giving the plants a cleaner growing season. Once harvested, the beans could be eaten fresh, dried for storage, or ground into flour. This flexibility mattered deeply in cold regions, where no single harvest could be trusted. Broad beans offered options, allowing families to adapt meals and storage to whatever winter delivered. Broad beans earned their place not through delicacy, but dependability. They grew without rich soil, heavy tools, or perfect weather. In years when bread was thin and meat was rare, beans filled the gap with slow-burning energy. Cold climate farmers valued foods that could sustain labor, not impress guests. Broad beans did exactly that, quietly supporting survival across centuries of frost, failure, and uncertainty. Winter cabbage became a pillar of cold climate survival because it solved multiple problems at once. It tolerated frost, grew large in short seasons, and stayed edible long after harvest. Entire heads could be stored intact in cool sheds or buried pits, remaining usable for months. In northern regions, cabbage wasn't just a vegetable. It was bulk food, capable of feeding families steadily through long, foodless winters. What truly set winter cabbage apart was preservation. Fermented into sauerkraut, it transformed into a shelf-stable food rich in vitamin C. This prevented scurvy when fresh greens vanished under snow. Barrels of fermented cabbage quietly sustained villages while fields lay frozen. For cold climate farmers, fermentation wasn't culinary tradition. It was survival science developed through generations of necessity and observation. Cabbage was never glamorous. Its smell was strong, its meals repetitive, but it didn't fail. In cold climates, that mattered more than taste. When gardens collapsed and grain stores ran thin, cabbage still filled pots and stomachs. It represented a philosophy shared by northern farmers. Food didn't need to be exciting. It needed to endure winter without demanding perfect conditions or constant care. Kohlrabi thrived in cold regions because it grew fast where time was limited. Unlike root crops that demanded long seasons, kohlrabi matured quickly before frost returned. Its swollen stem resisted cold and remained tender even after light freezes. For farmers racing against early winters, this speed mattered. Kohlrabi provided fresh calories when slower crops couldn't finish in time. Kohlrabi's value came from its flexibility. The bulb could be eaten raw, cooked or stored briefly, while the leaves added extra nutrition. Even when stressed by cold or uneven soil, the plant still produced edible food. In cold climates, perfection was impossible. Crops that forgave mistakes and weather swings earned their place, and kohlrabi did exactly that. For cold climate farmers, kohlrabi represented efficiency. It turned limited sunlight and short summers into tangible nourishment. When frost threatened early, farmers harvested whatever size had formed, knowing it would still feed them. This adaptability made kohlrabi dependable in years when careful planning collapsed under unpredictable weather and shrinking growing windows. Rye was the grain that refused to die in the cold. Where wheat failed, rye survived. It tolerated poor soil, low light, cold rain, and brutal winters. In northern regions, rye became the backbone of survival agriculture. It provided flour for dense, filling bread that fueled labor through freezing months. Rye wasn't chosen for flavor, but because it grew when nothing else would. Rye bread became synonymous with cold climate survival. Dense, dark, and slow to spoil, it delivered long-lasting energy. Unlike refined wheat bread, rye loaves resisted mold and staling. Families baked in large batches, trusting rye to remain edible while snow blocked travel and trade. In frozen landscapes, bread wasn't comfort food. It was structural support for daily survival. Rye also protected communities from total collapse. Its resilience reduced risk when summers were wet, cold, or dim. Even partial harvests produced usable grain. Cold climate farmers didn't gamble on fragile crops. They invested in rye because it spread risk across seasons. It turned hostile environments into livable ones, anchoring food systems where failure carried deadly consequences. By this point, cold climate survival had shifted from gardens to fields. Roots and greens filled early gaps, but grains carried people through entire winters. These systems weren't accidental. They evolved through centuries of loss, famine, and recovery. Every crop that remained earned its place by surviving cold, hunger, and uncertainty, and the next crops would prove just as essential. If this kind of forgotten knowledge matters to you, make sure to subscribe, because every week we uncover crops, skills, and ideas modern systems forgot. Barley earned its place in cold climates because it matured quickly and tolerated unstable weather. Short summers, cold rains, and weak sunlight rarely stopped it. Barley could be eaten as porridge, added to soups, or ground into coarse flour. It didn't require perfect harvests to be useful. Even modest yields provided nourishment, making barley a reliable grain in regions where farming was always a gamble against the cold. Barley's strength was versatility. It fed people directly, supported animals, and even helped preserve calories through brewing. In cold regions, nothing went to waste. Barley stretched meals, thickened broths, and stabilized diets when other grains failed. Its ability to serve multiple roles made it invaluable to cold climate farmers who needed crops that adapted as conditions changed throughout the year. Barley was never celebrated, but it was trusted. It didn't promise abundance, only consistency. In years when frost shortened the season or storms flattened fields, barley still produced something edible. That quiet dependability mattered more than high yields. Cold climate survival depended on crops that reduced risk, and barley did exactly that year after year without demanding ideal conditions. Oats thrived in the damp, cold conditions that defeated other grains. They tolerated poor drainage, cool summers, and thin soils common in northern regions. Oats became the foundation of simple but powerful meals, especially porridge. Warm, filling, and easy to digest, oat-based food sustained people through long winters when energy mattered more than variety. Oats weren't luxury food. They were survival fuel. A small portion delivered steady energy, warmth, and strength. If this kind of forgotten practical knowledge matters to you, make sure to subscribe. Every week we uncover crops and systems modern agriculture abandoned, but cold climate farmers relied on to survive. These lessons aren't nostalgia. They're blueprints for resilience in uncertain times. Oats fit cold climates because they matched daily life. They cooked easily, stored well, and paired with almost anything. In freezing conditions, people needed food that could be prepared quickly and eaten hot. Oats delivered warmth as much as nutrition. Their role wasn't dramatic but essential, keeping bodies functioning when cold drained strength and options were limited. With grains like rye, barley, and oats, cold climate survival moved indoors. Fields fed kitchens, and kitchens became the center of endurance. These foods didn't eliminate hunger, but they controlled it. They turned harsh environments into manageable ones. And alongside grains, another group of crops quietly ensured survival by growing where winter still lingered. Leeks were prized in cold climates because they refused to die in winter. Snow and frost rarely killed them. Instead, leeks waited patiently in frozen ground, ready to be pulled up when needed. Their long growing season allowed families to harvest fresh food even when gardens appeared dead. In winter, leeks provided rare freshness, flavor, and vital nutrients. Unlike stored vegetables that slowly declined, leeks stayed alive underground. Cold actually improved their sweetness, breaking down starches into sugars. This made them both nourishing and comforting in harsh conditions. Cold climate farmers valued crops that could be harvested on demand, reducing reliance on storage and minimizing waste during long winters. Leeks functioned as living storage. They didn't rot in bins or dry out in sheds. They simply waited. In regions where cellars failed and preservation was imperfect, this mattered enormously. Leeks blurred the line between field and pantry, offering a rare advantage in frozen landscapes where food security depended on timing as much as harvest. Parsnips were uniquely suited to cold climates because winter improved them instead of destroying them. Frost converted their starches into sugars, making the roots sweeter the colder it became. Farmers often left parsnips in the ground through winter, harvesting them when food was scarce. In frozen regions, parsnips weren't rushed crops. They were patient reserves, growing better as conditions grew harsher. Unlike fragile vegetables, parsnips tolerated snow, ice, and neglect. Even when fields froze solid, the roots remained protected underground. Early spring harvests were especially valuable, arriving when stored food was nearly gone and new crops were not yet ready. For cold climate farmers, parsnips bridged the most dangerous moment of the year, the hunger gap between winter and spring. Parsnips carried a quiet lesson. Hardship improved them. Cold made them sweeter, not weaker. That reliability mattered deeply in regions where nothing could be taken for granted. Parsnips filled stews, roasts, and broths when morale was low and options were few. They didn't promise abundance, only consistency. And in frozen landscapes, consistency was survival. Sorrel emerged early in cold climates, often while snow still lingered nearby. Its sharp, lemony leaves delivered rare freshness after months of heavy food. Rich in vitamin C, sorrel helped prevent deficiencies when winter diets became repetitive. Cold climate farmers valued sorrel not for calories but for balance, a living reminder that spring always followed even the longest winters. When stored food ran low and new crops were weeks away, sorrel filled a critical gap. Its perennial nature meant it returned year after year without replanting. In cold regions, this mattered enormously. Every plant that survived winter reduced labor and risk. Sorrel's resilience turned neglected ground into nourishment at the exact moment it was needed most. Sorrel blurred the line between medicine and diet. Its acidity stimulated appetite, aided digestion, and refreshed bodies weakened by winter scarcity. Cold climate farmers understood that survival wasn't only about calories. It was about preventing illness and maintaining strength. Sorrel offered both, quietly reinforcing health when the environment offered little else. Nettles were among the first plants to appear after snow melted. Wild, aggressive, and impossible to eliminate, they thrived where cultivation failed. Once cooked, their sting vanished, revealing a plant richer in iron, protein, and minerals than most greens. For cold climate communities, nettles were not weeds. They were emergency nutrition growing freely at the edge of survival. Nettles required no planting, no care, and no protection. They simply appeared. In cold climates where labor and seed were precious, this was invaluable. Families harvested nettles for soups, porridges, and early greens, often relying on them before gardens fully woke. Nettles represented a critical truth of survival. Sometimes the most important food is the one you didn't have to grow. Nettles fed both people and animals, strengthening entire food systems. Their deep roots improved soil, while their leaves restored nutrients lost during winter. Cold climate farmers understood that resilience often came from wild plants, not controlled fields. Nettles thrived in chaos, offering strength precisely when order broke down. By now, survival had come from roots, grains, and greens. But cold climates also depended on fruits that tolerated frost and scarcity. These were not delicate orchard crops. They were plants shaped by ice, acidity, and patience. And in the far north, they delivered something just as vital as calories: preservation, vitamins, and hope through the darkest months. Cloudberries thrived where almost nothing else could. Growing in bogs, tundra, and frozen ground, they endured cold that destroyed traditional orchards. Rich in vitamin C, these golden berries became critical in northern diets, especially where fresh greens were scarce. In Arctic and subarctic regions, cloudberries were not treats. They were protection against deficiency, preserved through winter as jams, sauces, and dried stores. What made cloudberries valuable wasn't abundance, but reliability. They returned year after year, even after brutal winters. Their natural acidity helped them store longer than sweet fruits, reducing spoilage. Cold climate farmers understood that fruit didn't need to be plentiful. It needed to survive ice and deliver nutrition when everything else failed. Cloudberries did exactly that. Lingonberries spread low across frozen landscapes, protected by snow rather than destroyed by it. Their high acidity acted as a natural preservative, allowing them to be stored in water or simply kept cool for months. In northern regions, lingonberries added vital vitamins and flavor to winter diets dominated by grains and roots. They were small, but powerful allies against monotony and malnutrition. Lingonberries didn't rot easily. Their chemistry worked in favor of survival. Cold climate families relied on them precisely because they demanded little effort to preserve. No sugar was required. No complex techniques. The berries simply lasted. In frozen regions where energy and resources were limited, foods that preserved themselves earned permanent value. Small fruits carried people through winter, but cold climates also relied on plants that dominated space and produced abundantly year after year. These were not fragile crops. They were giants of resilience, returning even after snow, ice, and neglect. And among them, one plant stood apart, towering, versatile, and deeply woven into survival traditions. Angelica was a true giant of cold climate survival. It grew tall, thick, and fast, even in harsh northern conditions. Nearly every part was useful: stems, leaves, roots, and seeds. Its strong flavor and medicinal qualities made it valuable when diets were limited. Cold climate farmers didn't see Angelica as an herb. They saw it as insurance growing in plain sight. Angelica strengthened bodies weakened by cold and scarcity. It aided digestion, improved circulation, and added depth to otherwise bland meals. In northern regions, food and medicine were never separate categories. Plants had to serve multiple roles to justify their space. Angelica earned its place by feeding people while keeping them functional through long winters. Angelica represented a core principle of cold climate survival: diversity reduced risk. When one crop failed, others compensated. Angelica's resilience across seasons made it dependable when systems collapsed. Cold climate farmers didn't rely on single solutions. They built layered food systems where failure in one area didn't mean starvation. Cold climate farmers survived ice, famine, and collapse, not through technology, but wisdom. They chose plants that endured neglect, frost, and uncertainty. These crops still exist, quietly waiting outside modern awareness. Reviving them isn't nostalgia, it's preparation. In a world facing climate instability and fragile supply chains, the lessons of frozen fields may matter more now than ever before. Cold climate farmers didn't survive because they were stronger than us. They survived because they understood limits. They planted for failure, not perfection. They trusted crops that endured neglect, frost, and uncertainty. In rediscovering these plants, we're not looking backward. We're looking for tools that still work. Because when systems become fragile and conditions turn hostile, survival doesn't belong to the most advanced. It belongs to those who prepare wisely,